The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, we're ready to get started. Thank you all for joining and welcome to the Javelin Strategy and Research webinar, Securing the FI Contact Center, sponsored by Nuance. I'm Krista Mendoza and I'll be your moderator today. I'll soon be turning the presentation over to Krista Tedder, Head of Fraud at Javelin Strategy and Research, and Simon Marchand, Chief Fraud Prevention Officer of Biometrics and Security at Nuance Communications. Before I do, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you hear an echo, please check your audio and make sure telephone is selected. Questions are welcome, so please type them in the question box and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. If you have additional questions after the webinar, we'll provide contact information at the end of today's session. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and a link will be emailed to all participants tomorrow. And now, please welcome Krista and Simon.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And Simon, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this session together. And thank you to our Rockstar audience. We asked for questions and you delivered. We received so many questions and have formatted this webinar presentation to answer as many as possible. However, when you receive well over 70 questions, we might not be able to address everything, as well as we have a Q&A at the end. So we will be doing some follow-up if we do not get to your question. Also, in addition, Securing the FI Contact Center is a report that is being provided through Nuance, so that will also be something that you will receive, as well as the slide decks for participating. Our agenda today is focusing on what a lot of us are hearing in the industry right now as it relates to COVID-19 and the economic recession that has begun because of that. There are definitely fraud implications that are being faced right now that we will be discussing. We're also going to discuss a concept of think like a criminal, because a lot of times we focus on digital transformation and frictionless experiences, and we think like the customer when we build out different digital experiences and contact center experiences. So we wanted to start thinking a different way and shift the paradigm for you. And then really looking at securing the contact center, some of the technologies and some of the recommendations that are coming through our research, as well as situations and experiences that Simon is bringing to the table as head with Nuance. And then we will round it out with a question and answer session. Feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar session, and towards the end, as we go through the questions, we will try to answer as many as possible. So fraud implications with COVID-19, we all know that there is a shift of working from the office to work from home. And the way people are shopping is very different. The way merchants are engaging with consumers are very different. So that really leads into right now is a ripe opportunity for criminals to focus on digital fraud channels. And where identity fraud is coming into play, we see it in three different ways. The first will be account takeover, which really is something that we will be focusing on as part of this session, because contact centers are integral to protecting the account. We will also be discussing new account fraud. There are some things that you can do for both account takeover and new account fraud. However, there are some nuances. And then card not present fraud. So the fact that, frankly, you are now ordering online and picking up on at the curbside, the moving from going to the brick and mortar stores to online and mobile channels, there's so many things that are occurring that can make it really challenging to know what is normal behavior and what is not normal behavior. And we'll talk about how the contact center where the contact center fits in with these type of fraud threats that we're seeing across the digital channels. So first, let's take a little deeper look at account takeover fraud. And what we're seeing from 2019 to 2018 in overall account takeover fraud, there's a 70% increase year over year. And we took a deeper look at the different channels of account takeover to get an understanding of where this is occurring. Major credit card accounts, they are the #1 choice of account takeover, generally because you have the ceiling to buy and the availability. They're really trying to see how much money they can get in as short a period of time as possible. So when you think about account takeover, approximately 40% of all activity occurs within the first 24 hours. So that leaves, there's a lot of rapid change that's going with account takeover that is really important to understand. We also look at what actions they take, and they're taking changes with account number changes, address changes, phone number changes, email account changes. So any type of information to change the account to take it over, that's what they're doing. And contact centers are frontline with this because a lot of times they might call in to the contact center, pretend to be the person with the account, change the information, and then it's a slippery slope and it begins. And then they can rapidly make changes. But they're able to pass basic authentication questions. So what's your maiden name? What's the password? What's the address? And then they're able to change the information with the CSR if they weren't able to change it online. So that is a really important task within the contact center. Of anytime account information is changed, it's vital that the true person is making the change and not someone who just knows information about the true person making the change. One of the other areas that is important to understand is email account takeover has increased slightly. We expect to see this increasing more this year. Primarily because taking over an email account, say for example Gmail, provides the criminal access to receive the one-time passwords when they go to reset a password online to be able to take it. So some of these account types is really the beginning of taking over other accounts, and it really falls through. Down at the bottom of this slide, you can see it's not just credit cards, however. We are seeing personal loans, lines of credit. Right now with home equity lines, we would expect that this is an area that will increase as well. So it's important to make sure that you protect not only the checking and savings account, but all the different lines of credit. And just briefly touching on the checking account, one of the challenges with checking accounts right now and why they're going to be even more popular this year is because P2P fraud has spiked over 700% in the past 3 years. So when someone takes over a checking account, then they're able to immediately send money, and it's real-time deposited in another account, and it's irrevocable. So that's an area to just pay attention to when someone does make changes in a contact center or online, that information needs to be immediately placed into your fraud detection systems to be able to manage the situation. Now, new account fraud is a little bit different than account takeover, but it's still really important when it comes to understanding who the consumer is, who the true person is, and making sure that it's a valid identity. And then once the account is open, new card fraud isn't necessarily the account. It really is then all the actions that occur after the fact. And in many instances, as we were doing our research, what we were finding is that the criminals were calling into the contact centers on new accounts. If they change the address right away or have something changed on the account, oh, you made a mistake, it's actually this instead of this address, and the change is made, then they can immediately have access. Because with a lot of new accounts now, with the digital experience, you want them to have immediate access. So it's digitally provisioned on a mobile device. And so it's no longer just waiting for an account to be, a card to be sent in the mail. It really is that immediate access. We've seen a massive spike when it comes to new online accounts, such as marketplaces, eBay, Amazon. You can also look at merchant retailer accounts like a Walmart, because a lot of times large marketplaces will then, after you have an account for a period of time, they'll offer you a payment product, a loan product, and it's an easy way to start building an account history. So new account fraud, this is an area that, because of the economic situation, similar to what we saw in 2008, we're expecting to see a spike in new account fraud and account takeover. The third type of fraud that we're really seeing within the environment right now, in large part, is card not present fraud. And you can see the longitudinal aspect of card not present fraud. And we've seen spikes before. It's plateaued over this past 12 months. However, because of the situation today, we are expecting to see this gap widen. So the point of sale generally has a lower incidence of fraud rate of 1.2%. Card not present activity is 3.1, and this will drastically increase because a lot of point of sale transactions are now turning to card not present. Click and collect, so when you go online and you make your order and then you go pick up curbside, that's considered card not present, even though you're picking up the goods in person. So it's going to shift how normal purchases are made, so the good transactions, and it'll make it harder to find the bad transactions when someone takes over an account, because your transaction modeling is probably going a little wonky right now. It doesn't know what to expect because none of this is normal. Use analytic normal behavior, and nothing's normal, your score range is going to be more challenging, and your analysts are going to let things pass. You will also see card not present fraud within contact centers because they will call and change the address and then have items shipped. So one of the areas you can look at card not present fraud and seeing where you might need to adjust your strategies is in your disputes office. Being able to see what chargebacks come in, what's happening, and being able to make the adjustments. So that is an area that you can go ahead and make those changes. So these are the three fraud types. So now we need to think like a criminal. And right now, consumers are confused with what's happening. They are sitting on hold in some instances for a long period of time. So tempers might be short. Your staff is probably stressed. They might be working from home in environments they're not used to. So that whole environment is a perfect area for criminals to operate. They like chaos. So when things aren't normal and it's all chaos, it's really important to change how you think about certain things. So let's take a look at the consumer contact points. And this really is focusing on how consumers resolve questions related to payments. And this could be related to financial services, into banks and credit unions, but it's also about brokerage and 401k and healthcare. These really are ways that consumers are comfortable in contacting. Currently today, contact centers are still the #1 way of a consumer getting an answer. They call the number on the back of the card, they call the number on the website. Calling is whether or not it's preferred or not, that could be a different question, but call centers are the #1 way. The second way is in person, 32%. Now, the fact that in-person or branch-related activity is at a standstill. Yes, some branches are open from a drive-through perspective, but it's not where you can just drive down to your local branch and get a question answered. So now you have volume coming into your contact centers, and they are really then increase the volume of calls that are coming in. And your CSRs most likely are trying to just resolve questions and concerns as fast as possible because they know that there's a long line of other customers who need their information there. So unfortunately, when we look at call time and the average handle time of a call, when we reduce that time, that is really when social engineering can take effect. And the person calling can really start extracting the information because the CSR just wants to validate the information and answer the question and move to the next call. The third channel that we see is with mobile and online banking, digital chats. So contact centers are more than a phone call. Now they're also chat areas. You can send SMS and email. So it's an area, contact centers are really a heartbeat of an organization where consumers can get their answers. And then we're also rounding out social media, much smaller percent, 4%. What we generally see is they like to be able to ask basic questions, locate ATMs, or track a purchase, or find out how to do disputes. So social media right now, really from a financial services perspective, is low. However, when you start asking questions related to a merchant standpoint and following up about service or delivery, that number will increase. But from a financial services perspective, it is low, which means for a large group of financial services, it's not as protected. So when you think of a customer, think about what areas or what channels might not have as much protection around that, and that could be social media. So you do want to make sure you monitor that. But frankly, criminals are really going to gravitate to your contact centers because they know that there's an influx of calls. And the thing about criminals, they're very patient. They will sit on hold for as long as it takes because their goal is not to get a question answer. Their goal is to be able to take the money. So from a social engineering perspective, this is what they're like really going after. And there are different ways of doing this. And sometimes it's the manipulation of the CSR. They might have some information to pass through the initial validation, but they're changing the email address. Because as I mentioned, changing the email address, where we would generally see that as a low level, easy change, most people don't change their email address. Frankly, I've had the same email address for 20 years. I don't really change it. So most consumers don't change it. It's really easy. We don't put a lot of control around that. Same with online passwords, because frankly, who likes passwords? We use passwords because it's easy or because it's the only thing that the company allows us to use. But they're very easy to forget. They can be difficult. Do I use upper or lowercase? Do I need a special character? So online passwords, one of the #1 requests that come in. However, again, it's something that the criminals want to do as well, especially if they're going to change the email address. Physical address for shipping and receiving, as well as the address verification that merchants do. So it could be digital content that requires the address verification. Now, PIN number. PIN number is interesting because we are seeing higher usage of cash during the COVID epidemic. It's not necessarily that they're using the cash at the retailers, because we are seeing an increase in digital transactions. However, it's what we call mattress cash. So changing a PIN number, especially for someone who doesn't use an ATM on a regular basis, when they call in, they might say, I need to change my PIN. I just need to make sure I have cash in case I need it. And your CSR probably is going, oh, completely understand, and I agree. Help the criminal change the PIN number, and then they're off to the races. As well as obtaining a debit card or credit card if they haven't generally used a debit card before. This is a time when they will call in and say, I'd like a debit card because I don't want to use cash. And the CSR will be like, yes, I agree. The other changes, phone number changes, add user to the account, obtaining checks. Checks are not as much, but it amazed us when we did our payment survey how many checks are still used in the United States. So it is still something that is easily manipulated and also can be used, especially if they then use a check to do the remote deposit capture. That's also a concern. that we need to be aware of. So, Simon, I'd like you to jump in here as we talk about the different types of authentication. So I just hit quite a few challenges that we're seeing in the market related to making sure we speak to the right person who's making all these change requests. From an authentication perspective, one of the key questions people have is how do you make it seamless so you don't come off as like harassing the true customer, but yet you have all of this protection?
Yeah, and it's actually a very good question. Authentication has always been seen like a trade-off between security and necessary friction that it adds, and the ease and the customer experience. But before we go there, I'd like to highlight some of the challenges that we start seeing with our customers, but that also we should be expecting following the crisis that we're all living through. I mean, you talked about account takeovers, new account fraud, and card not present fraud, but there are challenges that are very specific to the situation we see now. You know, going back, and I'll go a little backwards for this, but talking about card not present, most financial institutions or even merchants that are tracking their transactions to try and detect fraud are often basing their detection method on transactional information, on habits, on behaviors. And one of the problems that we see in the information that's been shared with us is that now legitimate customers have an erratic behavior, a suspicious behavior, not because they're trying to hide something, but just because the crisis and the pressure it puts on people makes them behave differently, which triggers a lot more alarms for fraud teams to work. And as we all know, fraud teams will not have additional resources to work their cases now. So I think it's important to keep in mind that if you have the proper tools in place, you will be able to, instead of tracking fraudulent or suspicious transactions and relying on established behavior, you can try to determine if it's the real person that's doing it and try to track the fraudsters performing suspicious transactions. Which brings us to, you talked about how we see fraudsters targeting call centers, and I think we can reasonably assume that we will see even more fraud attacks against call centers because fraudsters are well aware that agents are now put in remote locations. They're not going to work from traditional call centers where they have access to resources close to them. They're not as well supervised as they are in a call center. Now people are working alone. They feel isolated, which puts a lot more pressure on them to find solutions to resolve their customers' issues. And fraudsters are using that. They're putting pressure on the agents to get them to go through the authentication process without getting all the proper answers. Call center agents are more easily manipulated now that processes are changing quickly, and they might not have appropriate training to understand the new processes put in place. There's a great lack of supervision, so there's no one actually looking at what they're doing, controlling if they're following the authentication processes in place, which makes it easier for fraudsters to get through the traditional knowledge-based authentication questions. And it highlights another risk. Now we're putting agents in their houses with access to very sensitive data on our customers, with no real way to track what's being done with that information, how they're treating that information from their home. And in a situation where we're seeing massive layoffs, we're seeing an increase in or a potential recession coming, there's going to be increased pressure on agents who might be afraid of losing their jobs, who might have financial pressures, which might lead to an increased risk in occupational fraud. And as managers, as enterprises that are the keepers of very sensitive pieces of information, we have to ask ourselves if asking questions based on all of that personal information that we display on monitors that are not supervised, are we exposing our customers to additional risks that this information might now be stolen not only by fraudsters hacking into databases, but by agents that are pressured into taking that information and using that new opportunity that's being given to them to steal information and maybe perform identity fraud on their own. And the other thing I would like to highlight is we're also anticipating, you were talking about new accounts. We tend to look at new account fraud from a perspective where we try to see if fraudsters are trying to move in, but we're starting to see opportunistic fraudsters, first-party fraud more and more, because people might have lost their job, for example, but still have a good enough credit score that helps them open multiple credit products or open multiple accounts, hoping that if they get in trouble or if they need to, they can make fake fraudulent claims to an insurance company, obtain handsets, then claiming that it was a fraud and that they were a victim. So we're seeing that rise in opportunistic fraud. And all of this is a result of the opportunities and the pressure that the COVID-19 situation is allowing people to take advantage of. So that being said, what's the goal here? How do we reduce the friction in the authentication process for legitimate customers, but at the same time, if you can backtrack to the previous slide, at the same time, reduce that friction, but make sure that we have all the tools to secure our interactions, make sure we don't let fraudsters in, make sure we don't let the suspicious changes to the accounts being performed. And the key for that is to identify the individuals that are trying to perform transactions. Instead of trying to track suspicious behaviors, let's track suspicious individuals. And the way we do that, and you see it here, there's multiple different pieces of technology that we can use. You are probably well aware of how facial recognition fingerprint works, but there's other things we can leverage and use. Voice biometrics is how you sound. Voice biometrics is language agnostic. You could be virtually speaking a made-up language, and we would still be able to identify an individual. Because it is how you sound, it is based on the physical aspect of your throat, your nose, your mouth, your palate. And all of this is used to create a unique biometric profile. Now, conversational print, which you can see on the slide here, is focusing only on the language itself. So it doesn't pay attention as much as how you sound, but the words you use. What's the sentence structure? What kind of vocabulary are you using? You tend to hesitate a lot. So that allows us to create a profile for legitimate customers. Obviously, if I was to call my bank, I have a specific vocabulary, I have a specific sentence structure. But at the same time, fraudsters also have those scripts that they're going through. And as we see that COVID-19 crisis and fraudsters trying to hit multiple enterprises in a row, we see them following specific scripts, distributing those scripts to either fraud call centers or mules that they're hiring off the web or on campus in normal times. So conversational print is really that second print that we're creating for individuals based on their language. And the combination of both allows us to make a safe determination that we're speaking with our expected customer or with a fraudster within a few seconds of a call taking place. That means, and if we move forward, you'll see a quick scenario. That means that if a fraudster is trying to take over an account, we already know that they have in their possession, they have the credit file, they have the IDs, they have all the credentials. They don't need anything more to be able to get through your normal security process. So that's why what biometrics technology allows us to do is to listen passively to the call, transparently, without having to ask any kinds of security questions, taking a couple seconds of audio to let know the agent in real time if they're speaking with the right person. Now, if they're not, we're taking that voice and we're comparing it to all the known fraudsters that your organization has encountered in the past. And if that voice doesn't match an existing fraudster, we can still listen to what's being said. Is the vocabulary or the jargon being used suspicious for the type of request that's being made? Is the structure of ideas that's being followed to get to a specific result or to make a specific request, is it normal for a legitimate customer, or does it sound like a known behavior, known fraudster script? All of that can take place in combination with other validations. Are you using a device that has been determined to be a fraudulent device before? Are you trying to spoof your phone number to maybe get through an ANI validation service? All of this can be merged and calculated together to provide a confidence score in real time to your agent that they are speaking with the right person, or that they might be speaking with a fraudster, and therefore they should either escalate the call to a security team or ask for additional validations, which might lead to, you know, asking for someone to provide physical evidence of their identity.
And Simon, based on the score that you can provide to the analyst, I'm always aware of call centers seemingly always have new hires. So with the confidence score, from an operational perspective, can these calls be directed to a more senior staff or people who have been trained in how to work with people to really then follow through additional authentication?
So there's multiple ways to implement that kind of technology. Some customers decide to provide, you know, real-time feedback to the agent, pointing them to a specific procedure to follow. Other customers that we have will rather have the flag lead to an escalation of the call to a more experienced customer service agent or directly to a fraud or security analyst. And we have other customers that decide to let the call go through and have the fraud analyst analyze the transaction right after it took place, which allows you to gather more evidence and more information, and also to use the transaction itself as a risk factor to determine if it should be prioritized or not. Obviously, if you have suspicions on the individual you're speaking with, and there's an address change that's performed in the account, you want to prioritize this over, for example, someone who's just asking to ask for a balance of an account. So there's multiple ways to deploy it. The key here is really that within a couple seconds, we can make that decision to follow any process that a bank or a telco or an insurance company or even a government service wants to put in place when they're dealing with a potential fraudster. Now, that being said, this is mostly what you're seeing here is mostly to secure the contact center. Now, we know that fraudsters, if they see that the contact center has been properly secured, they will move to something else. Now, to go in a branch in this COVID-19 situation will be difficult, as most branches and stores are closed, so they will go on the digital channel. So before I show you exactly what we'd be doing, I want to quickly touch on behavioral biometrics. So because you do not have that contact with the individual that's either on an app or online, instead of using their voice, we can track their behavior. So what you see here is what we would be tracking if that person was using a web portal. So we'd be looking at the key press, we'd be looking at how a mouse is used, what's the sequence of keys that's being pressed, how they're navigating online, which kind of menus they're going for, where they're clicking on screen. And all of this can happen transparently while the customer is using their portal. Now, if they're using an app, we would be using additional factors. We would be looking at the gyroscope. We can look at the angle of the phone, how it's being held, what's the surface of the thumb that is used to type directly on the phone. So that allows us to have two distinct profiles that can be used either online on a web portal, on a laptop or a desktop, and have another profile on how a smartphone is used or a tablet, for example. And now that information can be used to do a transparent risk assessment, even though the fraudster might have, again, the credentials to access a web portal. They might have the answers to the security questions that we usually ask when we see a device for the first time. Well, as they are navigating online, as they're trying to get to the balance, try to make a change, if we can bring the slide forward, please, we will be paying attention to their behavior. If that behavior is the one that we're expecting, then all good, we let the customer move forward. But if the behavior is suspicious and the transaction that's being performed is suspicious, we're able to step up the authentication. That way you do not induce friction when not required, and stepping up the authentication through an app allows you to validate a biometric factor. And at this point, you can ask the customer to speak a quick sentence in the phone to get their vocal print and be able to authenticate the person that's supposed to be logging in. Now, if the interaction is through the chat, I was mentioning conversation print, because conversation print relies on words and language, it is possible to use that technology in chat sessions. So, we can pay attention to the words that are being used, the spelling mistakes, the punctuation, is the person using emojis, at which speed are they typing, and again, we can use that to authenticate a legitimate customer as well as a potential fraudster. So all of this can happen on the digital channel.
And I think Simon, this is a point I'd like to drive home, because I think this is critical. Because what we found in our research last year when we were looking at the new tools that criminals were using, one of the new tools that was expanding isn't really a new tool, it was human farming, where they have hundreds of devices attached to a table or a board, and so they never move. And so the device, I mean, let's face it, have you ever held your device completely still while you were using it? No. So if something's on a board and you're getting zero gyro indicators or other behavioral indicators aren't there, I think that's important. Plus, they were also using scripts. So it was the same conversation over and over, just in 100 applications run by one person. So I think this here is going to be a huge way to combat how criminals are attacking financial institutions right now.
Yeah, and we have seen in the past that it's been something that was available even a couple of years ago. When you're purchasing an identity off the dark web, an identity that will cost you maybe $20 or $30 if you're just buying one, but much cheaper if you're buying in bulk. Some websites will offer you to buy the voice, not the voice of the person, but just to buy the voice of someone roughly the same age that will read through a script for you. It's going to cost you an extra couple dollars. You put it in your basket, you check out, pay with Bitcoins, and you'll have a fraudulent call center place the call for you to a target institution and follow a script that you have provided. So it's very important to have the capability to track if someone's calling from a potential fraud call center, obviously. And I'm talking about stepping up. I think stepping up is extremely important. Two-factor authentication is important, but a lot of banks and a lot of enterprises are still relying on one-time passwords via SMS. And I think for those of you that are specialized in fraud, we can all agree that SMS two-factor authentication has its flaws. It's been proven to be a flawed method to authenticate customers, because the information is so easy to obtain nowadays online. It's so easy to purchase that fraudsters won't mind taking an extra 10 minutes to just perform a SIM swap and start intercepting the SMS messages. So that's why stepping up through an app, through a push notification is the way to go. And by doing that, if you're already deploying voice biometrics in a call center, you can use that voice print that you're creating as your step-up authentication factor. So that means that fraudsters will not be able, even if they were to steal the device of the customer, they would not be able to go through. Because if the voice was recorded, we would be able to identify that. If the voice was synthesized, we would also be able to identify that. So regardless of which scheme the fraudsters are trying to perform, even if they're trying to swap the SIM, if they're trying to transfer the calls, porting out the phone number from your original carrier, or even calling you, posing as a bank fraud analyst and asking you to read the password that's being sent to you. Regardless of the method being used, if you're using step-up authentication through the app with a biometrics factor, you're ensuring that your customers are well protected and that SIM swaps will not be a way for fraudsters to get through. Which brings us to what I think is key for the future, and it's having a layered approach to authentication and security. I've mentioned voice prints and conversation prints and looking at behavior, but all of this has to work from a single platform. It has to work together. If you're getting your authentication solutions for 3, 4, 5 different providers, you're running into a big risk here, and it's that fraudsters might find a flaw to exploit. But if you have one platform that takes all of those biometrics and non-biometrics factors and merges them and crunches them through an AI risk scoring engine, then you're making sure that that single point of failure is avoided. That means that even if a fraudster would try to synthesize a voice with a new technology that just came out, well, you would still be able to look at the conversation print of the person or the print of their device. But if you're just relying on the print of the device to authenticate someone or to try to detect fraudsters, let's be honest here, fraudsters can go online and purchase 5,000 devices for very cheap, and they will just cycle through devices, cycle through SIM cards to make sure that they can circumvent that device printing technology. So it's using it as an additional factor of security, not the only factor of security. And that's true for everything. All of the technologies that you see listed here have to be taken together and have to work together from one single platform. That's the best way to be future-proof. That's the best way to try and and also the best way to remove the friction that you might induce in your customer experience with legitimate customers. And when that's well done, you can even go one step further and protect your customers from potential occupational fraud by removing some of the personal information that you would usually display to your frontline agents. If your frontline agent has the certainty that they're speaking with the right person without having to ask security questions, and you don't have to display the address, mother's maiden name, date of birth, and list of all assets that they have with you. It's not necessary. And at this point, you're securing your customer's information even more than you would with any other authentication method.
And Simon, one of the questions that was asked was related to how authentication can help with the synthetic IDs and new accounts. So I think folks are understanding how it helps with account takeover. Can you just talk briefly about how layered authentication helps with new account fraud?
Yeah. Well, what we always suggest is that not only should we use the technology to track if a legitimate customer is calling in, but this can really listen to every single call or every single interaction you have, even with potential new customers. Because if a fraudster is calling and you have identified that voice in the past, we'll be able to tell an agent, even if they're not an established customer, we're able to tell that the interaction is suspicious. Now, if a voice is synthesized, we're also able to let the agent know that they're speaking with someone that has a synthetic voice or a suspicious voice. And if we go even one step further, in certain regions of the world, so in the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia, we're even allowing our partners to share fraudster voices with each other, which allows you to have the fraudster's voice even before they make the first call and use that information to trigger alarms when they decide to target your organization. And I think sharing information is really the key between fraud teams. And for those of you from Canada, a couple of years ago when ATM attacks were a thing, we used to share information when we saw ATMs being targeted, and we would share where the points of compromises were within a couple of minutes of an attack taking place. And I think the next step is to do the same thing with voices, with ID theft and synthetic ID theft. So we're allowing that data to be shared because we think that even though we are all competitors in the end, banks are competitors with each other, when it comes to disrupting the fraud business and when it comes to facing our corporate social responsibility to put an end to the fraud issues and everything else it facilitates, sharing data like this is an advantage for everyone.
I definitely agree. I'm a huge fan of data sharing because we all know that they're attempting across multiple financial institutions. Sometimes I know it can feel like you're the only one under the attack, but odds are if you're facing the criminal, others are too. So I think that's a great approach to share the information where information sharing hasn't been available before. So as part of the report that you'll be receiving following this webinar, we've gone through and identified several key areas related to how to secure the contact center. Some of them are technical, some of them are not technical, but there are 3 areas where we really recommend focus. This first one, inbound fraud detection. I think when people hear the term inbound fraud detection, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that you have a fraud detection unit sitting somewhere in your organization using a fraud system, a case is created, and they make outbound phone calls. Generally, that team also has inbound fraud calls that come in. So what we're recommending related to inbound fraud detection is different than what comes through from your case management system that you are monitoring from the side. And that really is being able to leverage your contact centers and create the mechanisms to be able to identify account takeover and new account fraud before it gets to the transactions level where you're actually losing money. So one of the key things to focus on is if you identify it up front, you don't have the losses. But Simon, one of the things that comes to mind is when I was in operations and I was managing fraud losses, and my key performance metrics were dollars lost, or hey, we got below this, or decline rates. When you're actually preventing the transactions from occurring, have you seen best practices on how to build key performance metrics, or how do you know it's effective?
Well, it's always difficult, and I think we can all agree that making numbers and reporting on fraud savings is always difficult. There are different approaches, and I mean, on one end of the spectrum, we have HSBC, which has publicly stated, that's why I'm sharing that number, that voice ID, so voice biometrics through Nuance has allowed them to save £395 million last year only, which is a huge amount of money. And that's because they're looking at their potential losses. They're looking at the 17,000 customers that were targeted by fraudsters and how much they were able to secure from those accounts. And we have other customers that will be looking, at just the raw number of victims that not victims, of frauds that they prevented, looking at number of accounts targeted. So there's really multiple ways to do it. You can look at all the assets that you secured. You can look at all the attacks that you have detected. You could be making an average of what an undetected loss or undetected attack leads to. The problem with that is with voice technology or with voice biometrics, because we detect more than 95% of the fraud cases, we're saving a lot of money. So you can't really start looking at an average loss after a couple of years. You really have to keep in mind that deploying that technology displaces the fraudsters completely. So although you might not see as much in terms of material losses, it's because the fraudsters are not interested in targeting companies that use biometrics. So fraud teams should always be mindful of how they report their savings and their operations.
That makes sense. And I think we have to there's a new paradigm that we have to look at when it comes to how we measure contact centers. A lot of people focus on net promoter scores, or it's more about how long the call takes. And fraud metrics generally aren't in the contact center operation. So I think that's important. I think one of the things that would help with that is the second recommendation of creating a high-risk call unit. So this is where you would have your tenured agents, and a lot of organizations also outsource some of their work to contact center providers. So maybe this is a group that you would want to keep in-house, but at the same time, you need to be available 24 hours a day, because frankly, criminals will call at 3 in the morning. They don't care. So having a group of people, whether it's in-house or with a provider, that can handle the analytic output. So you were mentioning that the indicator, Simon, was available. Having someone who isn't rattled by seeing the indicator pop up, I think is really important. I've managed call centers for a long period of time, and finding people who are naturally curious and aren't trusting, those are some of your best fraud agents, and you need a few of them in the contact center. But then also someone from an operational perspective who can manage the console, who can monitor and see what's happening. So one of the things that we want to make sure with our recommendations is that technology didn't become what we call shelfware, where it's purchased, it's used, but not really maximized from the reporting capability, dashboards, and all of that situation. So I think that is important to also think about when you're looking at adding technology, is not just from a technical perspective, but from a operational perspective and a reporting perspective. And then the third recommendation is focused on dispute resolution. This is also a kind of niche field, but we mentioned when it comes to card not present fraud, when it comes to account takeover, you're going to have, when the true person calls in, you're going to have distraught people. They're going to want to know, how do they get their money? Can they get their money? How did someone get access to the account? And you're really going to want to know how people can help the consumer resolve the situation as quick as possible. Especially, as I mentioned, with P2P rates being so high right now, it's really important to focus on this. We received several questions related to Net Promoter Score. And how do you think about Net Promoter Score, and how authentication kind of can impact Net Promoter Score? And frankly, I think strong authentication will increase your Net Promoter Score. Strong contact center security will increase the Net Promoter Score. Everything from screen pops, so that when someone enters the information from the IVR and it gets to the agent, so they're not being asked multiple times, to having behind the scenes authentication, where they don't even know they have to answer the questions, that makes consumers happy. Simon, what have you heard from your customers related to the improvement lift that authentication can give?
So proper biometric authentication has several impacts. Obviously, when it comes to savings, we're moving from the detection layer of the fraud management cycle to the prevention layer. So you're detecting fraud before it takes place. You're not only saving the potential material loss, but also all of the work that you have to put in contacting your victim, managing the case itself, and obviously all the impact of having to tell one of your customers that their account has been breached, which we all know has a long-lasting effect on trust. That being said, proper authentication, when you only need 2 seconds of audio to authenticate someone, you're cutting at least 40-45 seconds from a call. It scales up pretty quickly, and we have been able to reduce their average handling time by up to 87 seconds for those that had the longest authentication process. But there's other little things that we don't think of, and that's been shared to me by a couple of customers. They have seen absenteeism of the call center agents go down. And that came with the reduced stress that call center agents are feeling after authentication has been made through biometrics, because they don't have to ask the questions, they don't have to play police, they can focus on what they have been hired for, which is to resolve an issue and help customers, instead of trying to determine if they might be talking to a fraudster. And that has significant impacts. I've heard numbers where absenteeism went down by 10%, which has, of course, effects on our daily operations. Also has an impact on call center agents' churn. So if you don't have to train new call center agents, if your training is shortened because the authentication process is automated, that's also some savings that should be considered when you're looking at an ROI for a voice biometrics case.
That definitely makes sense. And we have time for one more question. One of the questions that came through is about where you see the future. I think innovation will be coming within contact center security.
So I think now that we have brought the technology to a point where, like I mentioned, we only need 2 seconds or even less of audio. It facilitates containment of the legitimate calls in the IVR. Now, if you're calling in a natural language understanding IVR and you're saying, hey, my name is Simon, I want to know my balance, I have enough audio to be able to authenticate you, and I can provide that information right away without having to go through a menu, without having to speak to an agent. So that's really where the future is going when it comes to interactions with legitimate customers. When it comes to fraudsters, we obviously see a lot of technology around deep voices and deep fakes, so we have to be aware that it is a potential risk, even though of the more than 500 million voice prints that we manage in the world, we haven't heard of a successful fraud attack against a customer using synthetic speech. We are well aware that technology is moving very quickly, that eventually fraudsters will have to resort to synthesizing voices. So that's where the future of fraud will be. And that makes it even more important to, going back to what I was presenting earlier, avoid the single point of failure, make sure you have the most up-to-date system. You were talking about, not deploying a technology and just leaving it there, but maximize what we can do with it. That also includes, migrating to new versions to make sure that your algorithms, your biometrics algorithms are always up to date, which can be made easier with a software as a service approach to authentication. Instead of having a system that you deploy on premise and update every 2 years, having a cloud-first solution like the Nuance Gatekeeper solution allows you to receive your newest algorithms as they're made available in the market. That way, you not only make sure you always reduce the authentication time as much as you can, but you're also ready for when fraudsters are going to have enough technology to synthesize voices and try to attack accounts with that.
That definitely makes sense. So everyone, we really appreciate you joining the conversation today and the questions that you submitted. If we weren't able to get to your question, we will be following up with you, as well as you will be receiving a copy of the report and also the slides from this presentation. So feel free to share it with your colleagues because this is an important area of securing the financial institution, securing the contact center. With the type of fraud that we're seeing right now, this is essential. So if you have any questions, please reach out to us. And thank you very much for attending.